Last week we talked about a bunch of different stuff happening in the video game industry. This week we'll of course be continuing that, along with some new stuff that has come out that I think is kind of interesting to talk about. But it will be a shorter week. Doesn't seem like a lot of interesting stuff has happened. I will say that I will be ignoring the Monster Hunter Rise stuff for next week because by then we'll have a weekly basis to kind of talk about. I will be also ignoring, I think it's Split Fiction, that has also released, and I will be ignoring the Pokemon ZA. And that one is different because I've kind of already talked about it, and at the same time, you can go watch it. It's just more exciting what's going to happen. If you're a Pokemon fan, it's much more, not newsworthy, it's much more of just like entertainment to like be excited, what conspiracy, all that. But we're going to talk about some new stuff and some old stuff, and get into it right now. So Acclaim Entertainment is checking to make its comeback as a indie game publisher focused on original IPs. Now, if you don't know what Acclaim is, which don't get me wrong, while someone like me may remember Acclaim, I'm still even kind of too young to really enjoy a lot of their offerings. Like, I do know them because I play a lot of retro, but at the same time, a lot of people, even if you were playing games, probably don't really remember them for, because their last few years was pretty mid. But they are the ones behind Mortal Kombat originally, which is now owned by Warner Brothers, I think. NBA Jam, which that's definitely EA. EA controls sports, and Turok, which I don't know who owns that at this point. But they also have like Wizards and Warriors, which is much more, that was already gone by the time I was around and playing video games. I mean, it was there, but it wasn't there. But Acclaim is set to kind of come back and become a more recognizable name again, where it's focused on indie games, which we've kind of seen before with a lot of different stuff. It's kind of like trying to build up an older company to in the video game space again to like be an umbrella corporation kind of thing. It's very weird. I don't really like it a lot of the time. I do love getting funding for indie games. I'll never say no to some of these people that work insanely hard on them. But there is always a caveat with publishers. There's always a scary factor. And while some publishers are very understanding of the video game space, not everybody is. And I feel like just in general, the biggest takeaway I have in hope of this is that they become much more not become much more, but they are one of those publishing companies that is much more understanding of how the industry sits, because I don't think a lot of publishers are, and it's very, very hard. I will say they were focused on, like, their primary focus being on general funding and localization is like a very key factor. Localization has been slept on since forever. If you get into as many markets as possible, you will sell more games. And if you price it well enough in the currency of the country, you will sell a lot. Even if it's not necessarily a fantastic game, it could just be mid and you will still sell a decent chunk. It's just how much value you're pouring into the game versus how much of a return, and so on and so forth. But they also have stated that they will be looking into the older IPs that they kind of worked for, and they will try and revitalize them for new generation of gamers, which I think is actually a very good thing. I feel like a lot of, just in general, game series are gone. And don't get me wrong, I'm of the camp that eventually a game series should just die because it doesn't really work nowadays, or like, what are you going to do that's going to be impressive? Like, a great example I've always thought of is Bionic Commando. It's a great example because a lot of people love the game, whether it's, you know, the NES game, or even like, I think the Game Boy one is really good from what I've heard. Haven't played it. But, like, if you talk to people, Bionic Commando is one of the, like, most, like, fondly remembered. But I don't want it to come back. And it's like that with some bigger franchises. I'm a huge Mega Man fan. I think it's pretty obvious sometimes. But I don't necessarily want it to come back. And I think hopefully some of the older IPs they're looking at, they kind of let some of them stay dead. Because while it would be nice to see a return, I don't necessarily need or want those to come back. And I'm sure there's some hardcore fans. But that's what you're basically feeding into is the hardcore fans, and not necessarily getting new generation of gamers. Some of those games are very specific. How would you put it in a modernized setting, or are you just gonna kind of remaster it in a different way? Like, ultimately, I don't really see a lot of those older titles really being good in a current landscape. I do think some of them would fit, but I also don't know what IPs they're necessarily talking about, so I can't really say whether it's a good or bad thing. I do think what some of the major ones are just not going to be available for them, which really sucks. But they want to publish 3 to 4 games eventually, but they are of course building up. That's what is kind of the setup. I'm excited to see how this works out. It's always a scary thing when it comes to seeing a old, I guess not powerhouse, but an old company like this of Acclaim kind of try and step into a modern age, because they've been gone since 2004, and I think they tried to come back and failed in around 2010 or 2012, whenever that happened. So we're in a modern age, or more modern orientation, so we'll see what happens there. But going into that, we have of course more problems at PlayStation. I think I've talked about the layoff problem back last week, but we have more layoffs over at PlayStation following all their live service cancellations. I think I didn't really talk about the live service cancellation stuff, but one of the biggest problems that has kind of shot itself in the foot is Sony in general, not really understanding how long a game needs to be there to make a lot of money. Like, there's of course the God of War success, but you look at how long the God of War took originally, and then God of War Ragnarok took to come out, and it's not an easy time to make a game. That's not to mention how hard live service games are. I mean, look at Concord; it failed pretty hard, which is kind of the end of the line for a lot of these, and it's kind of basically pushed off a lot of stuff. But this time last year, I think it was around March, I think they got rid of about 1,000 employees, and that was like 8% at the time. They still say they are working on a Horizon live service game, which you need to stop, Sony. You're just gonna burn everything at this point. But there was another game supposed to be from the same company as Days Gone. I'm trying to read this and it's really bad, but it's they canceled that one. They canceled a lot of the live service games at this point, and it's just really sad to see a lot of projects that are just going to be gone. But we'll see how more of that breaks loose as time goes on. Next, we go into more talking about Wonder Woman. I talked about Monolith being closed with Warner Brothers last week, and it's talking about how Wonder Woman was similar to God of War, which is not really a surprise to me. God of War is one of those games that I feel like if we were back 10 years ago and people were much more willing to throw money at bigger projects without like canceling them, we would have seen a lot more copies come across. And it's just it really sucks that Monolith Productions is not really around anymore. But when it comes down to apparently how it was going to play, it was supposed to be like God of War, and also at the same time, apparently the studio has been going through a slow death. I've known for a while that the Monolith has been like slowly dying because a lot of its staff left a long time ago to form Cliffhanger, I think it was. But when it comes down to it, it doesn't, like, it just seems like it was a killed studio even after several successes, because Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, from what I know, are very successful. And I do know that one of the biggest problems was, of course, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League was a massive failure. Multiverses basically died, and Quiz Champions didn't really get that far. And there wasn't a lot of progress on Wonder Woman, and so they kind of axed it. But when it comes down to it, I think Warner Brothers is just going the same route as Sony, where they're failing to understand how the market is, and more importantly, how video game development has to be taken at this time. I'm kind of sad to see Monolith is finally like put into the ground in the coffin. But at the same time, I'd rather them die than release something and have my viewpoint of them be poisoned. But it's sad. But next we go into the numbers of Call of Duty being pretty low for, I think it's a record low on Steam, which is really, really odd for somebody like me who grew up during the Call of Duty craze. But basically, uh, one of the things that has been kind of, ruining for a lot of people is you have the skill-based matchmaking is very awkward for a lot of people, expensive microtransactions, and AI generate artwork, which, hey, I kind of talked about that already. Some of the new maps were very, very terrible. Apparently, I haven't played the new one. And it's just interesting to see how they try and address it. They banned 65,000 accounts for cheating and boosting. And a lot of players feel that this is not enough, which is insane. 65,000 accounts, and you still have a problem. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be changed to kind of get this rapid decline to go around. And also, it's a live service game in general, which is always gonna. I've been saying this for a long time. It's eventually gonna fade away. It's just not worth it. A lot of people, as they grow older, have less time, and you're targeting your game at kids and teens. And I think ultimately, as we go along in video games, we're already hitting like several generations of video game players. But as like live service hits the third generation of players, we're gonna see a lot less kids and teens play it, because you're gonna have the second and the first generation be like, hey, it's not really that worth it to spend 8 weeks of your time to finish the season pass. And I think ultimately what I predicted, where it will become more of a novelty, will become just the standard. Like, it's not going to be that prevalent as it once was just a few years ago, and even now. But we'll see what happens. I think live service is basically a doomed thing at this point, but we'll see how the decline works out, what they do to address it, and I'm interested to see, because Call of Duty is a massive franchise. And talking about another thing being on the decline, we have the first delisting for Switch Online, which I think is a very interesting thing to talk about. So Super Soccer, which I think is called Formation Soccer or Super Formation Soccer, whatever it is, over in Japan, is being delisted. I think I want to get a specific date, and I can't see it. But March 28th, there we go, will be removed from the Super Famicom, or SNES, library, which is available to Switch Online members in Japan. Yeah. One of the things that is kind of interesting is that they really haven't said why this is happening. It could be like a IP issue, but the original version was published by Human Entertainment, and the IP is now owned by Chunsoft, I'm pretty sure. Which I don't see why that would be a problem, but maybe there's a revitalization in the work, which would be interesting to see, or something along the lines. One of the things that kind of came out because of this is, of course, the co-founder of Platinum Games and the current Clover Studios founder criticized the move, asking the return of Virtual Console service, which was available on Wii U, and 3DS. He is a retro game lover, which I also am, and preservation is very important to me, so I'm hopeful that they kind of come out with something to kind of stop this at this point. I would really, really hate to see this, but another thing that was kind of brought up was Virtual Console in general had a lot of games that were kind of taken out through IPs. Sometimes it was just some like weird stuff happening. I think Yoshi's Cookie is one of those where it's kind of a weird case of like an old like lawsuit thing, I think I remember. But like some of these games, it's really sad to see them gone, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is classic for a lot of people. It's a terrible game. I don't know why you guys like it. But like SimCity is a great example. Street Fighter 2, Final Fight 1 through 3, and Super Turrican 2, and I think there's another one. I think Pitfall is on there from something. I don't remember the other ones, but I remember those all be taken off eventually in virtual console days. Mushmouth. And it's really sad to see how like game preservation kind of goes out the window when it comes to a lot of these IPs and stuff. Hopefully, we get some explanation why. I don't really like to see people kind of just lose access to a game, even if it's not a very big game. It's still very important to have it. I'm just interested to see why. But we have on happier news, we have a new trademark for Once Upon a Katamari, which, if you don't know, I always say Katamari weird. I've been told I say it wrong. If I am, I'm sorry, but they have put a trademark for Once Upon a Katamari in Europe, which is really, really cool because we've seen a lot of re-releases of Katamari stuff, but I would love a brand new one. Katamari is a very, very fun, what's it called? A very fun, just kind of relaxing game. I feel like it's very enjoyable. It has funny humor. It's also just very kid friendly. While it is sarcastic at times, I feel like it doesn't go overboard where a kid can really enjoy it. Definitely worth a check out if you have not played it. Reroll, I think, is usually on sale a lot now. I think it even has a demo somewhere, but if not, you can of course secretly find it on the internet and play some older ones. They are definitely worth a check if you haven't played it. Just wanted to highlight it because depressing news sucks. But we have more talk about. I say this wrong. Inzoi, whatever. Is the kind of Sims, the new Sims type thing. Well, it's supposed to replace the Sims. We have a lot of like information coming out, but not a lot on the price. It's supposed to have a global showcase March 19th, just ahead of the launch that will come in like a couple weeks later. But it will probably showcase the finalizations of like a lot of the stuff that will be in the game. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read as well. And it seems like a lot of the information for the game has already been talked about by one of the lead, whether it's marketing or development, it doesn't say, but there's a lot of information about it. I haven't been really following too closely, but it does seem kind of interesting to see how they're going to handle this. And what's interesting about this, and what's more important, is the price thing. They have not been clear on the price at all. And it's supposed to be a one-time purchase with mentions of DLC plans. Is it going to be like a Sims copy in that you're going to like have the purchase for the main thing and then DLC is going to be there forever, where Sims somehow, even 10 years later, Sims DLC is still the same price? Like, what's the deal? Or is it going to be a free-to-play service which will then have the DLC be like the cost? Or is it going to be like very small? Like, if you have a game release right now, I think if you want this to be a very big game, you release it at $25 with $5 DLC, and you can do like 8 DLC before it gets tired out. Or even if you do it at $25, people will accept $5 DLC for several times. Overall, I think you could even go up to $40, and you could have less DLC and people would still follow along, because at that point you're still slightly ahead of just like $50. You're only at $60, but people are much more willing to buy it, because I think price is a very important factor nowadays for new launching titles. I really hope that they aren't going with the free-to-play plan, because that usually means a lot of microtransactions down the line. I don't really want to see that, but I hope it's also low enough to really matter. I expect it to be a full price game because of the amount of work that seems to have gone into it, the amount of features, and I'm also getting a bit of a vibe of No Man's Sky when I look at the list of features that have been talked about but not shown. If you were around during No Man's Sky, you know how this is. It's very scary to see about a game and all these features and not being shown them, especially not with like a demo or anything this close to launch. We'll see what happens with it. I'm very interested to check out what happens with Inzoi. We have the March 18th, which means we'll probably talk about it uh, maybe 2 weeks from now, or even 3 weeks, depending on how this orders out. But yeah, we'll see what happens with it. And we have our final thing for the day, and it's talking about more hatred towards Xbox and EA. I wanted to bring this up because I talked about BioWare with Veilguard a bit last week, and we had the co-founder, I always say his name wrong, Zeshuk? I don't know. It's Zeschuk. And basically talking about how the worst bit of advice he's ever received was launching Jade Empire at the end of the original Xbox lifecycle versus the beginning of the 360 lifecycle. Because if you don't know, Jade Empire was actually a very good game, for the time anyway. It's considered a cult classic RPG on the original Xbox that didn't sell amazingly, and a lot of people will call for it because it was during an awkward time where people were waiting for newer consoles. Because the difference between now and then with newer consoles is, with the newer console, a lot of people will kind of wait because older consoles don't fail as much. Like, it's not like an immediate death when a new console is announced or even like showcased. Like, look at the PS2. It lasted far longer than the PS3 could ever hope to. Look at the GameCube. The GameCube stood around for a little bit because we didn't have enough consoles. Didn't have enough consoles to sell. There we go. Speaking is hard. But when it comes down to how Jade Empire sold, it seems a lot of people think it sold pretty terrible for what it could have been. And I do think it probably would have done a way better if they waited for a launch title on the 360, especially since you look at the launch titles of the 360, and being a part of that would have been really, really impressive for the Jade Empire. Because I think your only other game that is like unique that kind of faded out is Cameo, I think, which is still a good game. It's just it's Cameo. It's not fantastic. So it definitely would have been like interesting to see that alternate timeline, see how BioWare would have actually ended up. But the response here is that Microsoft was like, no, 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 you should release it now, right at the end of the cycle, because it's a great time. Which I could kind of get, looking at it now, like hindsight is like, that's a terrible move in general, because like everybody was super excited for the next generation, because while we hadn't really been around the previous one of the PS2, the GameCube, and the original Xbox for that long, people were excited for HD. That was kind of the new thing, like 1080p, not 1080p, 720p, sorry, was kind of the big thing. The idea of, instead of getting the white, red, and yellow, we were now getting, I think it was red, white, blue, green? Right? That's the correct order. I'm sorry. It's been a long time. You could tell we just use HDMI cords now. But ultimately, it was kind of a new time and very exciting to see consoles take on an HD form. But it would have been interesting to see how Jade Empire would have reacted. That's not what happened. And I feel like complaining about it now at this point is kind of just being like, taking zero blame on yourself for a lot of these decisions, because at the end of the day, you were recommended or given advice and you chose to go through with it. I get it. They probably should have known better, or they were of course manipulating you, and that's wrong, but you still ultimately made the decision. So I really hate when people kind of get on the back of like a bigger company like this, because they're looking at it from a business perspective. They want to sell more original Xboxes as they go into the 360. They're looking at it from that perspective, whereas you want to build a massive game that sells incredibly well, and they don't really see that. So you have to make the decision there. Ultimately, nobody wins here because it didn't sell as much as it should have, but at the same time, you have no idea if it would have sold more as a launch title, because it's just the way it be. But overall, I did want to bring mention to it because we talked about BioWare, and it's just always fun to talk about. Alternate timelines would have been interesting. But that's it for this week. Ultimately, not a great big news cycle, or at least a news cycle I'm willing to talk about. We will be talking about the games of Monster Hunter Wilds next week. I think Split Fiction would be next week as well, along with maybe some more Pokemon as we get more news about it. But that's it for now. I'll talk to you guys later, and hopefully you guys have a great day.